Morning and welcome to this day 4 of the 32nd Orkney International Science Festival in this Scotland's Year of Stories 2022. So my name is Dr. Mike Bell and it's my pleasure to be introducing this session where we're going to showcase a small selection of student research in Orkney. And you'll come to see that this really does pick up on some of the themes in the Year of Stories. So we'll be looking at place and culture and community and telling stories about how we can reach a more sustainable future. So we have 5 speakers today from 3 higher education institutions working in Orkney. So I'll introduce each of those, starting with Alona Reuterstein. And Alona is going to speak on the topic of sustainable tourism with Orkney as a case study. So Alona is a second-year PhD student at Robert Gordon University School of Creative and Cultural Business based in Aberdeen. And she's passionate about Scotland, its history, places and people. Alona's research interests include rurality and islandness, social cultural sustainability, heritage tourism and sustainable destination development. And then we'll be moving on to Katie. So Katie Waring is going to share her MSc thesis research from this summer, where she explored an Orcadian ecosystem with significant benefits for society. And those benefits come both locally and within a global context. So Katie is an MSc student on the International Marine Science Programme at Heriot-Watt University in Orkney. So Katie has a background in international education and project management. She's based in Stromness. She's an avid diver. In fact, she's just back from a diving adventure out to Sulstack. And she's an amateur underwater photographer with a passion for all things aquatic. And I think that's going to come across in her talk. Before we move on to Flora. So Flora Robertson will speak on the topic of community-owned and managed energy systems. So Flora is a first-year PhD student at Heriot-Watt in Orkney. So she lives in Orkney and she studies the benefits of community renewable energy across Scotland, working with Dr. Mark Hull. Flora has a background in landscape architecture and renewable energy development, and she uses the techniques from both of those professions to assess and address the development of rural communities and the integration of renewable energy systems into sensitive landscapes. And next we have Henny Gunawan. So Henny is going to speak on the topic of finance for community energy systems in Eastern Indonesia. So reaching out from this island group to another very much larger island group. So Henny is a PhD student also studying at Heriot-Watt's Orkney campus. And Henny is passionate about finance and energy, hence her choice of the research subject. She's a firm believer that transition energy is the pathway of the future, hence would like to dedicate her time and energy to the research in new and renewable energy. Then our last speaker is Adele Lidderdale. So Adele is going to be speaking on the topic of Scotland's National Islands Plan. So Adele graduated from Orkney College UHI, the BSc in Sustainable Rural Development in 2012. She completed an MSc in the same subject in 2022. She's had a fulfilling career in the Isles, working for EMEC and OIC in various roles, including data technician, hydrogen project manager, and climate change officer. She's recently embarked on a PhD to evaluate the efficacy of the Scottish National Islands Plan in supporting the island's development aspirations. So those are our 5 speakers. I want everyone to take part in this event. And I'd ask you to please enter your comments and questions in the YouTube chat or Slido, and I'll present them to the I'll present those questions to the speakers after all the talks. So the link for Slido, you can see the QR code on the screen, and the link is www.slido.com, and you need to enter the code, which is 3435541. So I'll repeat that. The code for Slido is 3435541. The link and code are also posted in the YouTube chat. So if we have the next slide up, please. I'll start with the briefest of introductions before handing over to Alona. So here's our title for today, Horizons from the Harbour. If we could move to the next slide. Here we can see the view of part of Stromness Harbour from the Orkney Research and Innovation Campus, where Heriot-Watt University is based. So this is one of the harbours. If we go on to the next slide, we can see the view from the other way. And building in the centre of this shot again is the Orkney Renewable and Innovation Campus, where Heriot-Watt and Robert Gordon University are based, among other organisations. So next slide, please. So I've mentioned 3 higher education institutions in Orkney. So Heriot-Watt have been based for 3 decades in Orkney and has a focus on marine resources, renewable energy and energy transition. And that's based in Stromness, the campus you've just seen. We also have Robert Gordon University at the same campus. So Robert Gordon's University's involvement in Orkney is multidisciplinary, involving people from across the institution. So they have themes relating to smart islands, creative innovation, and sustainable quality of life. Then finally, we have UHI, which has 3 research institutes: the Institute for Northern Studies, which looks at culture and heritage; the Archaeology Institute, understanding the historic environment; the Agronomy Institute, development of plants and plant-based products, focusing particularly on the Highlands and Islands. So we have speakers, I'm delighted to say, from 3 of these institutions. So Heriot-Watt, Robert Gordon, and UHI's Institute for Northern Studies. So if we can take the next slide, please, and I'll hand over to Alona from Robert Gordon University to take us into our first talk. So thank you, Alona.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present my project here at the festival. Can I see the first slide, please? So my research is about sustainable tourism strategy evaluation, and I'm doing this in Orkney. Next slide, please. So this strategy evaluation is sustainable tourism strategy, which is Orkney Tourism Strategy 2025, and its current version can be found on orkney.com. In this evaluation, I'm looking to find out to what extent the strategy includes the principles of sustainable tourism development, to what extent it addresses the sustainability needs of Orkney as a destination as defined by its stakeholders, as well as what would be the success criteria for its implementation. So here on the slide, you see a snapshot of a vision and objectives, and I'm asking my participants to reflect on those during our interviews. Now, this strategy is currently being reviewed by Destination Orkney Partnership and other stakeholders, as well as the action plan is being developed for its implementation. But because these are not yet finalized, I'm working with the existing documents at the moment. Next slide, please. So why strategy? Because sustainability is by definition is a long-term concept, which requires a long-term strategic approach, and that includes tourism. And why now? So the idea for this study came about during the first lockdown, when there was a lot of commentary about how this is the time to stop and rethink whether our development is as sustainable as it should be, given what we've learned from the pandemic. And therefore, are our strategies still applicable? And that includes tourism as well. Therefore, the evaluation. And there was a literature gap recognized as well. There are some strategy evaluation research out there, but it mainly targets national level strategies or organizational level strategies. On the destination level, however, there are studies that apply a generic evaluation frameworks to a large number of destinations in one region. Here, it is argued that context matters, and every destination will have its unique contextual setting that will affect the strategy, and by applying a generic framework, this might be missed. Particularly cold water island and archipelago context, studies on which are quite limited. And here also it is argued it's important to study and learn the sustainability needs of a particular destination as defined by its stakeholders from the opinions of the stakeholders, as well as how do they envisage success in strategy implementation before actually attempting to evaluate the strategy to make sure that it can be recognized within the document. And why Orkney? Well, because it does have a strategy to evaluate, as well as the unique context of Orkney as a cold water archipelago, as well as our geo connections, as Mike introduced at the beginning. And next slide, please. So just a bit about those layers of context that I mentioned just now. On the right-hand side there, you see just a simple diagram that I use to illustrate how I approach studying those layers of context in that contextual setting of Orkney. So Orkney, obviously, it's a rural destination, as well as it's an island destination, but not just an island, it's an archipelago. And it's not just an archipelago, it's a cold water archipelago. And every of those layers implies that there will be something in common, say, between all rural destinations or all island destinations. However, there will always be some unique set of circumstances that will be pertinent to a particular destination that might affect its sustainability needs and therefore its strategies. And on the left-hand side there, just to illustrate simple illustration of one of those contextual features of the islands and archipelagos. How is your crossing? A question that I've heard a number of times when traveling to Orkney or between Orkney Islands. And this is not the question that you hear on the mainland a lot or on the continent. And that motif of crossing in its tangible and intangible forms affects the sustainability needs of a destination, probably in all industries, but in tourism in particular, because in its tangible form, you will need to make sure you take into account the logistics of the crossing and the infrastructure that is required in the transport. From intangible point of view, it might mean it might affect the motivation of a visitor to come to Orkney, to cross from the day-to-day and the mundane and something that they're used to something new and unknown and different and perhaps a bit idealized as well, that might bring its own challenges. Next slide, please. So here is my conceptual framework that guides me through my research. You can see that the research is of 3 stages. First is the stage 1, the prerequisites, I called it, because these are the things that I need to know before I attempt to evaluate the strategy. So I speak with members of Orkney community and I'm asking them about what do you think sustainability needs are of Orkney as a tourism destination, and how do you envisage success, and many, many other things. So I will learn that last layer of Orkney in its context. Once I've finished that, I will be able to attempt the strategy evaluation and the strategy development and the content and implementation where applicable. Once I've evaluated the strategy, I will be able to provide, in stage 3 there, recommendations for future strategic planning in Orkney, as well as lessons learned to other destinations as well from this whole process. These stages are framed in 2 dimensions there. First one is that new normal that I mentioned in the beginning. And I'm asking my participants, is there such a thing as a new normal? And does it affect sustainability needs? And how it might affect the strategy and its implementation going forward. And the other one is the layers of context that I just mentioned with its 4 elements. So people that are affected by sustainable tourism development, institutions such as any kind of formal organizations or processes, places that are affected by sustainable tourism development and the strategy, and the power dynamics between stakeholders that might affect implementation of the strategy as well. Next slide, please. So here on the left, you see a snapshot of the current draft of evaluation framework and those 3 stages that you saw on the previous slide. So under stage 2 there are lines that begin with EC, which are the evaluation criteria. And these are currently derived from those existing frameworks that I mentioned in the beginning, just by using simple in vivo coding to make sure that I've captured everything that they have to offer. But as I said, they're not necessarily applicable to Orkney. Therefore, after my data collection and data analysis, I will be able to adapt those to be relevant to Orkney. Once that's completed, I will be able to evaluate the strategy by giving a score to each evaluation criteria. And the score you can see on the right-hand side there from 2 to 0. And that's to obtain some robust reference, like a number that I can refer to when I'm working my recommendations, when I'm writing up my recommendations. Next slide, please. So here's the progress of my research so far. I've just completed my data collection, just one interview left, and then just started my data analysis, and that will include the strategy evaluation itself and the recommendations. And then I will obviously need to write it up, and that will include hopefully a project report that I will be able to share with Orkney stakeholders that participated in the research or anybody who will be interested to read. Next slide, please. Well, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Katie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alona. You can put my slides up. Okay, so my name's Katie, and I'm going to talk to you about my master's research, which entitled The Green and the Blue. And the green and the blue is seagrass. Next slide, please. So what is seagrass? Seagrass is a marine angiosperm. That means it's an underwater flowering plant. Now, it doesn't rely on dispersal by animals, so the flowers are somewhat inconspicuous. You can see in the very small, in the first picture here, the little hairs coming off the leaf is the flowers, and you can see the seeds in the second picture. So seagrass produces sexually through its seeds. It photosynthesizes, which means it's found in shallow coastal waters, and it's found throughout the world. It's found out in every continent apart from Antarctica, as you can see in this map. There's 76 species of seagrass. They all look very different. There's 2 in the UK, Zostera marina and Zostera naughti. Now, we're focusing on the more abundant Zostera marina, or the common name is eelgrass. And you can see from these pictures that it looks very much like terrestrial grasses. Another important biological fact about seagrass is its roots. So seagrass has got roots that go into the ground. Other marine plants like kelp, it's an algae. It has a holdfast and it holds on to things. The kelp doesn't go into the ground, whereas with seagrass, the roots do. It produces sexually through its seeds, but it also produces asexually through cloning through its roots, or we call them rhizomes. So it's a very important feature of seagrass. Next slide, please. So why is it important? So the talk has mentioned superpowers. The more scientific name is ecosystem services. And there's far too many for me to go into in 9 minutes. But I just want to draw your attention to the roots, and especially this picture here at the bottom. You can see that the roots stabilize the sediment, where you have a sandy sediment that might be prone to movement through wave attenuation, coastal erosion. The roots will hold it together. And it provides this 3D habitat, which is a place for animals and marine life to live, to hunt, to breed, to become established. So it supports biodiversity, and it's a really important nursery ground as well. Also sequesters carbon as well, and stores carbon in its roots, in its rhizomes, longer than terrestrial ecosystems would. There is many, many ecosystem services that we could go into with this. Next slide, please. Now, there's a lot of threats to seagrass. We found all over the UK. This infographic shows you some of them. I think the biggest takeaway is it's anthropogenic, so they're human-made threats. So in areas where you have high populations, you have a lot of pollution, you might have coastal developments. This is making the water dirty. The seagrass can't photosynthesize. You have eutrophication, where you have runoff from agriculture and different chemicals, changing the balance of the chemicals that are in the ocean. Also physical disturbances from anchors, from destructive fishing. So human-made anthropogenic stressors are what threaten seagrass. If you press the button. The good news is that we can restore seagrass. As I explained, they produce sexually and asexually. So you can harvest the seeds from seagrass beds and you can plant them to help degraded beds to be restored. It's very important that you work out why are the beds being degraded in the first place, and that you remove those stressors first before planting seeds. There is a lot of technology happening all over the UK, a lot of restoration projects happening, and there's a real need for seeds for these projects. Next slide, please. So why Orkney? You can just press all these down. Yeah, you just keep going with them all. Orkney has got really clear waters because of its location. It's got lots of sheltered beds, so it's got the perfect habitat for seagrass beds. We know about a lot of seagrass beds throughout Orkney, but there's a lot that have predicted that need ground truth. That just means that we need to go and have a look scientifically and see where they are. You can see on this map here where the predicted beds are. The beds around Orkney are thought to be pristine and highly productive. If you press the button one more time. We don't know that much about Orkney's seagrass beds. We need to know more. This picture here is from the Bay of Tukoi. That was a recent drone footage that was taken. So we really want to find out more about Orkney's beds because they do have the potential to provide seeds for UK-wide restoration, but we really want to know the extent of them, the health of them. Are they being degraded in order to do that safely? Next slide, please. So this is where my research came in. I was very lucky as an MSc student to come in at the start of a 3-year corporate socially funded project, CSR project, between Heriot-Watt, Project Seagrass and Nature Scot called Showgrass. So there was money and there was funding, and we were able to charter a boat. You can see in the picture here, it's the Gina Lane, for a week to go up to the Northern Isles to gather our data. Now, having the boat as a floating platform enabled us to navigate Orkney's weather, which we did have to. We didn't get to go where we wanted to go, but being able to move about the Isles, and because Orkney does have so many beds, and we were able to collect our data. If you press the button. So the aim was to assess the biodiversity and the ecosystem services provided by Zostera Marina around Orkney. So it was a preliminary study. Next slide, please. So to assess biodiversity, we did 2 things. We did epifauna diver surveys. So epifauna refers to anything that lives on top of the seagrass. So the animals and the plants that live within the seagrass. We wanted to find out what lives within the meadows and does it differ between them. So you can see we have 2 divers. We lay a 25-meter transit line. One diver goes along with the GoPro and the other one goes along with the dive slate, and we're recording what we see there. These are some interesting species. We've got a stalked jellyfish on the left, and we've got a snake lock anemone on the right. Press the button. We also did in-fauna coring. So we did the epifauna diver surveys at different seagrass so we could compare them, different meadows. We did it at Stromness, at the Mallow Bank, and on Westray. The in-fauna coring took place in the Bay of Tukoi in Westray, where there's an extensive bed. So we want to look at in-fauna as the animals that live in the sediment. So we want to take these plastic cores, we hammer them in, so we've got a cross section. You can see us taking them out, then we sift the sand out, being careful not to damage any of the animals that live in it, and then they are quantified and counted. Next slide, please. So to assess the ecosystem services, we used BRUVS, which stands for Baited Remote Underwater Video. Now, this is a really unintrusive and cheap way to gather data about what lives within the seagrass. Obviously, when you're using divers, you're disturbing the marine life. So we have these units, they're baited, we put them in and they deployed for an hour. If you press the next slide. So you can see us putting them in here. So these were at the Bay of Franks in Stromness. So we put them down, you leave them for an hour running, and then you go and see what you can see. Press the button again. We had 6 units. So we put 3 of the units on the seagrass at the bottom, you can see bottom left, and then 3 of the other units were off the seagrass. So I wanted to look at what species live within the seagrass, hoping to find some commercial species, but what ecosystem services does it provide? We had to use scuba and snorkeling to deploy them. Next slide, please. This is just some footage, some of the shots, so you can see the difference between, and we had a seal as well, which was quite interesting. Next slide, please. So our key findings, what did we find out? You can just go through these. So the biodiversity through the epifaunal services, surveys through the different meadows differed greatly depending on the location. It was a very different animals that we found in each of them. We did find a higher abundance of fish compared to in the seagrass compared to not on the seagrass. And we did find commercial species, both cod and pollock were found in the meadows at Stromness. More key findings are, it's just the beginning. More research is needed to fully understand Orkney's meadows. Next slide, please. So the future for Orkney's seagrass, you can go through these again. What makes seagrass special is it's an accessible ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that is in shallow coastal waters. You don't need to dive to see it. You can scuba dive to see it. It's something that communities can be aware of. And as I discussed before, the threats to seagrass are anthropogenic. They are human-made. So how do you mitigate that? Well, humans need to understand that seagrass is beneficial for them and that it should be protected, and especially fishermen. If it produces commercial fish stocks, then they're going to want to protect it. So education and awareness is key. And with the communities in the Northern Isles around Orkney, we really want to make them aware of what they've got on their doorstep. So I'm delivering an education programme with part of NILPS to Westray Primary School this coming month. And hopefully we can do some more community engagement work. We do need more scientific research to understand our beds and the health of them. And you can get involved as well through citizen science. There is an app called Seagrass Spotter. You can see these photos here. We've got some of the seagrass will often get washed up on the beaches. So if you're walking along a beach and you see big, long, just looks like grass, have a look for the roots as well. You can get the Seagrass Spotter app on your phone and you can log the location where you found it. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Thanks very much for listening. And I'm going to hand over to Flora now.
Thank you, Katie. Next slide. Hello, everyone. My name is Flora Robertson. I'm a part-time PhD student, the equivalent to halfway through my first year at Heriot-Watt University in Stromness, with Dr. Mark Hull and Dr. Sandy Kerr as my supervisors. Next slide, please. The title of my PhD is The Real Power of Communities, Assessing Indirect and Social Benefit of Community-Owned and Managed Energy Systems. I have expanded this and developed this into a working aim for the time being, which is that the indirect benefits of community renewable energy are an under-researched area in academia and are currently lacking in rigorous analysis with quantitative outputs. The aim of this research is to investigate existing analytical systems and design a framework to allow communities across Scotland to analyse and provide evidence of the indirect benefits of community energy projects, to inform communities and provide evidence to policymakers. But what this really means is that over the next few years, I'll be working alongside community anchor organisations across Scotland, who have all been involved in developing their own community renewable energy projects, to identify the benefits that they have seen occurring within their communities that go beyond purely financial or income-based benefits and the benefits of generating clean energy. These will then be used to create a framework, and the evidence generated can be used by those communities and others to justify future projects, both to funders or potential funders and to policymakers. Next slide, please. Currently, I'm in the process of undertaking the literature review phase of my research. The topic of community energy can incorporate a huge number of topics, demonstrated in the diagram on the screen, which shows all of the strands of research that I'm currently delving into at the moment. This I've divided into three aspects: the context, both theoretical and physical, and then defining the research. The physical context comes down to how community energy is situated in Scotland and also in history. And for me, this includes exploring a wide range of concepts, including notions such as dúchas, which is a Gaelic word used to describe the traditional or indigenous ecological knowledge found in Scotland. And it's been described as, I quote, embracing landscape, a sense of geography, a sense of history, and a formal order of experience in which all of these emerged. And for me, this is a vitally important part of setting the context of any community development in Scotland, but particularly ones that have environmental considerations. Similarly, it's equally important to explore all of the aspects of theoretical context that may be relevant within this research. And this includes looking at perhaps the more predictable fields of economic, landscape, or political theory. Also, how alternative theories may actually have applicable aspects within community energy, such as spiritual or feminist theory or motivational theory. For example, gaining a deeper understanding of what motivates specific people or organizations to create community renewables and why. The strand of literature focusing on defining the research, is a more literal breakdown of the aim of the project. So this includes exploring and defining the metrics that might be involved in future discussions, as well as analysing any existing frameworks that are operating within this field. And this will include delving into the organisations themselves. Our focus is going to be on anchor organisations. So this will involve identifying what the key elements are that define these organisations within a community energy context. Next slide, please. The communities that I intend to work with on this project are the key to the whole research. My main goal with this research is that it's a collaboration and not something that is seen as done unto them. For this reason, the approach I intend to use includes co-design and participatory research techniques that will allow communities to help shape the research from the start. This will include finalising the research questions and the research aim, and debating the metrics that will be used within the analysis. The purpose of this is to ensure the metrics I analyse are providing evidence that will actually be useful to these communities in the future. Marked on the map on the screen are some of the communities that from initial conversations we're looking to approach to help guide the research from the start. Some of the criteria I've used to identify community anchor organisations are the geography, ensuring that there's a geographical spread across Scotland, including rural areas, but also urban settings, and technology, ensuring that there's a variety of renewable technologies covered. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I intend to develop the finalised list of metrics alongside the communities. However, before I go into these meetings, I've started to create a base list of some of the options that could be used. And these I can use as prompts within the meetings to inspire the community representatives to come up with more examples. On the screen are some of the metrics I've considered so far, with links to certain indicators that could be used to measure progress or benefit. For example, this could include exploring organisation resilience through the level of retention on local community committees, or exploring the benefits that come when organisations are able to afford to pay their permanent staff through income that they generate, rather than relying on grant funding. So that one way to explore this would be to calculate the number of hours the staff members spend applying for grant funding just to fund their role, and how long they spend reporting on that grant funding. Next slide, please. Moving forward with my research, the next steps will be to finalise my choice of case studies for my initial consultation, and to finalise the methodology I will use during these meetings to maximise the benefit of the community's participation. Along with coming up with a list of metrics to explore, I will use these meetings and conversations, which will hopefully take place this autumn, to finalise the research questions. Currently, the draft questions follow the process shown on the screen, with one question to explore the framework or the landscape that the thesis is situated, one to look at the process, and the final to delve into the impact. This work will all be running alongside the continuation of wider reading and the write-up of the literature review. Next slide, please. That concludes my quick run through my progress so far with my research into the benefits of community energy. My contact details are on the screen now if anyone would like to get in touch to find out more on anything I've mentioned today. Thank you to everyone for listening, and I'll now hand over to Henny.
Hello, my name is Henny Gunawan. I'm a second year PhD student in Heriot-Watt. So thank you, Flora, for giving the floor. So my research today is to discuss about designing a project finance renewable energy system in Eastern Indonesia based on the community energy. So this is a research that is I've done for back home where I'm from. So my supervisor is Dr. Mark Hall, Dr. John Porter, and Dr. Leuserina Garniati. Next slide, please. So the discussion today, the outline that I'm going to take is going to be the overview, the background of the project research I do, the literature review that I completed last year, and what will be the methodology that I'm going to use in this case, which is going to be the mixed method of the qualitative and the quantitative methods. Data collection and analysis. The data collection I already done so far, and what would be the analysis that need to be done in the upcoming year. Also, what would be the deliverable on the research itself, which is essentially to create a novel financing scheme for Indonesia, particularly in the eastern part. Next slide, please. So this is to just giving the overview what would be my research. This is my research statement in brief. So the financing scheme of renewable energy in Indonesia seems to be lack of structures and a holistic approach, specifically in community energy. Hence, it left a gap and need to be more research done in the field. But I found that the financing scheme are not a standalone subject and are affected by other research in other area, which can be bundled together. In this case, it's policy and regulations and renewable energy technology that are suited for the region. Therefore, I'm looking to investigate how to design a novel financing scheme for community energy that are related to all these three research areas. Next. So for the background, in Indonesia, we have a journal paper published, but it seems it's not details at the moment for what would be the financial perspective and non-financial drivers in the community energy. And we, in the country, we have abundant resources from solar, geothermal, hydro, wind power. But it seems like it's the resources for the renewable energy is still underutilized, specifically in the region where there is a lower electrification ratio. On the policymakers, in 2018, there was like presidential regulations, which is already encouraged for the future energy mix of renewable energy, 23% by 2025 and 31% by 2050. There is already this policy which are adequate, but it seems that the renewable energy growth is still slow. Hence, looking at how we can accelerate the mix of the renewable energy faster. And the last is limitation of the standardization of the financing scheme, which can be used for example, potential investor to come and looking at how to invest in renewable energy in Indonesia, specifically looking from the community energy perspective. Next slide. So these are one slide which essentially cover all my findings on the literature review, which is ongoing progress, but this is the one that I found so far. We have 3 areas to see. The first one is the policy and regulation. It's include the national energy plan from the one that I mentioned from the presidential regulation on the energy mix, and specifically looking at from electricity, state electricity company that we call PLN. So the PLN is the one who mainly provide the electricity in Indonesia. So it's kind of giving the special status to be the first right refusal. So this is the one who provide the main on-grid electricity structures in Indonesia. So looking at how the policy that they do, especially when deciding the tariff. So instead of looking at using the feed-in tariff, is using its cost generations electricity costs. So this is one aspect to see on the policy, and also looking at how the off-grid area can be explored, especially to decide the electrification ratio in areas such as remote area. So this is where the private sectors and community energy can be explored more in terms of the policy. On the technologies, renewable energy technologies, as I mentioned, we have abundant resources. For example, the potential for solar is as high as 208 gigawatt, but the utilization of the power itself at the moment is still like under 1%. So looking at the mature technologies, which is cheaper, where the aim is to be used by the community energy, which at the moment is still depending on a fuel base, which is like a diesel power. So that's from the technology side. From the financing scheme, literature review looking at few factors. The first one is looking at the project finance, which is a non-recourse that is separated from the parents company. So it can be like using its own profit and loss statement. And this is especially looking at the paper that have this small renewable energy project in Germany and using a project finance. Then looking at the private sectors, which not only specifically looking at the return for their businesses, but also looking at how the social responsibility of it coming for that specific like private sector companies. De-risking instrument, so how the cost of generation that I mentioned earlier can be looking at more to the fit-in tariff in the futures. This is a regulation that upcoming, but is still not implemented yet. And the last is looking at what the government assisting support already we have in all the villages in Indonesia, which is called village enterprise, which is BUMDes. So BUMDes is currently is already have status in terms of like legal status. So looking at whether BUMDes can be used to have doing the renewable energy project instead, for as a part of the owner or the governance of the electricity instead. Next. So this is the data collection part of my research, which is what I do most of the 2021 going to 2022. So as I mentioned, this is a mixed method because looking at the social science of financing and also the technology of renewable energy. The qualitative method that been done so far is the interviews. So I have interviewed 8 stakeholders at the moment, and also 2 focus group discussion. So the focus group discussion was separated in 2 parts, which is the first part is with players, stakeholders in BUMDes, and also looking at the financing scheme with the expert. And the second part is with the education academia, looking at with the students and the lecturer from Eastern Indonesia. So those are the data that I collected so far. The intention of the qualitative data is to feed back to the hypothesis that I have, which is at the moment looking at the 3 areas that I mentioned for the policy, technologies, and the financing scheme. From the hypothesis, the intention is to do the quantitative data processing. So looking at the hypothesis that been generated is to have the variables, like, for example, looking at the capacities of the hydro potential in Eastern Indonesia area. So looking at the variable, what is the install capacity, the supply and demand, and generating it using the panel data. So this is the cross-sectional data with the time. The intention is to have empirical research that going to see what will be the statistical relationship between one variables to the others. And also looking at the classic methods on the investment analysis, such as payback period, NPV, and so like the standard that we use to analyze the investment. And the last is using the Monte Carlo method. So this is the both methods that I'm using at the moment for the data collections. Next slide. So after the collected data, the qualitative analysis will be done, processed by the Envivo, which is going to give me a thematic analysis, what will be the importance to fit into the hypothesis. So, but the main transition from that hypothesis to the quantitative is to create a tier system. So the idea of the tier system is to classify what would be the different types of the community energy that existed. So this is from different perspective. One is from the potential and install capacity. So from the renewable energy sources itself, power capacities, supply and demand on the locations, classification of it, whether it's on-grid or off-grid structures, whether it's depending on the PLN, the electricity state company, or it's taken off from that structures, population rate in the community, and looking at the commitment and the literacy of the renewable energy of that community. So the tier system will be one of the deliverable in order to design how the financing scheme going to be. So obviously this is going to come by it's going to come by looking at what the data fit in from the quantitative analysis that I'm given as a reference, and designing the new tier system and the financing scheme. Next slide. So this is the deliverable design that I have at the moment. As I mentioned, it will be based on different source of funding, whether it's a loan, is a grant, or is the equity, and based on the governance of a community energy, which is like, for example, like with BUMDES or co-ops, for example, and tailor with different tier system, with the intention is looking at the capacity and community energy and community settlement size. So this is the deliverable that I hope to deliver in looking at the different community in Indonesia, so can design how the financing scheme is best for them for providing the renewable energy. So that's my slide, I think. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll hand it out to
Hello.
Sorry, to Adele.
Thank you, Henny. That's great. So I'm Adele Lidderdale. I'm currently in the first half of my first year of the PhD, looking into the benefits of the National Islands Plan. So I'm researching through the Institute for Northern Studies under Professor Donna Heddle, Stephen Heddle, and Dr. Andrew Jennings, who is based in Shetland. So the National Islands Plan, not that many people have heard of it. So going out and speaking about it in the beginning of this research journey, unless you're really working with policy, then generally in the population, It doesn't come into your day-to-day kind of conversations. However, it can have a huge impact on your life, on your well-being and your day-to-day life. So the National Islands Plan was published in 2019 after a fairly protracted journey to get there, which we'll discuss in a moment. It's got an initial funding package of £33 million, and it was developed partly in response to a campaign run by local councils in the islands called Our Islands, Our Future. And it's unique in a sense that not many other island regions have one. So next slide. So island peripheries, that could be a question mark. So on the map there on the left is the Scottish Government's classification of urban versus rural. So I know, being an islander myself, and general conversations, anecdotally, we don't often, or some people don't often classify ourselves as rural. For us, we can sometimes be the centre of the universe, and that's the story that we play out across various industries as well. So you can see on the map there on the right, the islands that the islands plan covers. So there's 93 inhabited islands, which is defined as 2 or more individuals that permanently inhabit there. But an island community can also be based around, you know, a community of interest. So rural regions globally tend to have, you know, primary resources. They have sources of food, they have sources of minerals, energy, these kind of things. So there's always been this interplay between urban and rural, and there's a huge body of literature that discusses that over time as well, philosophies, but also actuals in real life. So 98% of the landmass and 17% of the population, and a few issues facing our island communities coming forward. So into the next slide. Inspired by the stories theme for the Scottish Government, and also the Science Festival this year. So on the left there is a chap called Evan Feigenbaum for the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. He mentioned that island stories are becoming important strategically, economically, environmentally and developmentally. But I would argue that our social stories, the way that we formalise ourselves as communities, is also becoming an area of interest in research, and also as we're deploying things like outputs of plans, of policies, and things like community energy, all those types of things. So how we arrange ourselves in a community can have a significant impact on the outcome. So Baldacchino on the right there, who studied islands and islandness, mentions there that on the left we have this kind of view of islands and how they can be important, you know, globally, but then on the right hand side there's still this importance that we retain our kind of identity as islanders, not just culture, but, you know, a lot of the things that are applied to islands, a lot of the policies and plans that are applied in islands are applied to them, and not always of others. So on to the next slide. How do governments, local government, national government, international governments interact with these issues in communities? And the answer is policy. So it was quite shocking to find that in the UK, we just use a working definition of policy. There's no fixed definition and there's no international agreement. It's just kind of known, you know, anything we do with regards to politics, you know, can constitute a policy. So in the UK, it can be a simple line a politician mentions in a press article. It can be a law, it can be a plan, a strategy, a source of funding, and all sorts of documents down at the organisational level. So all of that combined makes a policy or a policy framework, or a policy landscape, sometimes as it's called. So it's complicated. On the right, the policy life cycle analysis. So my aim in this research project is to look at how the plan is impacting various levels in the community. So really, it would be great if it did follow this lovely neat cycle, but in reality it's much more complex than that. So I'll be looking at a complex view of the policy process. It's live now, it's been released, and lots of different things can have lots of different impacts. It's very difficult to say whether a policy is having an intended impact. And this is the thing in literature and in theory, that policies are tended to be assumed to be successful. However, policy failure is often ubiquitous. So that's what I'll be looking at here. What are the aims of the plan, and does that come to fruition in the real world. So if we look on to the next slide here. So the National Islands Plan kind of came from a bottom-up approach here. So there was a campaign that was launched in 2013 by Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles Councils in 2013, and they saw a window with the upcoming independence referendum in 2014 to ask for some changes that they had been wanting to negotiate for some time. So it's unique in the fact that the island councils had never really worked together before, and that's in the literature tends to be the case that peripheral regions or island regions would negotiate with the centres of power, tends to be government, but not always on an individual basis. So that in itself is fairly unique that they all work together. So what they asked for on the left was island proofing, sustainability of the islands, what do they need for that to occur, more autonomy and control over marine resources and energy growth. They wanted certain aspects of constitutional change and public sector change, more authority, more powers for the island councils. And they also wanted to instigate additional economic drivers and bring about, increased well-being for islanders. So off the back of that Our Islands Our Future campaign, the Scottish Government enacted the Islands Act 2018, which is a law. It legally enshrines islanders' rights in law, and there's lots of languages in there and feedback mechanisms to ensure that that relationship is taking place, that power transfer is taking place. Namely, the Island Community Impact Assessments is part of that Islands Act. So some of you might have heard about the recent remote air traffic control towers in the airports, and the Islands Community Impact Assessment was the mechanism that was used for the islands to say, actually, we don't think that's right for the islands. So that has been used in earnest there. From the Islands Act of 2018, there was 12 months to develop the National Islands Plan. And the National Islands Plan has got, we'll see on the next slide, but keep this slide for now, the 13 strategic outcomes. It has hundreds of different indicators to say whether it's going well or whether it's not going well. And consultation took place on the majority of those 93 islands. Hundreds of responses, 400 responses to an online consultation, 61 in-person consultation events, and 1,000 people attended those events across the different islands. So there was a fairly large campaign that led up to the development of the National Islands Plan. Some other laws that have been developed around that ask are the Community Empowerment Act has been further developed, the Crown Estate Act, which allows for marine assets, you can see on the left there, to be transferred, to be managed by local areas, and a fairly big kind of review of how the Crown Estate is managed in Scotland, potentially to increase the benefit for local areas. But my job is going to be looking at, does that actually happen? So on to the next slide. So there you go, very dry, 13 strategic outcomes there associated with it. So it's unique for me in that the outcomes are already defined, the indicators have already been defined. So my job is to look at how effective those have been. So the research strategy is going to be interviewing members of the councils, officers in the councils and officers in the Scottish Government who were involved in the Our Islands Our Future campaign to find out what their experience was in that campaign and whether they believe that the strategic outcomes match up in theory with what they asked. It's really important for me to keep mindful of 93 different islands. So in the literature, there tends to be a lot of cross comparison between Scotland and other regions globally. However, as islanders, we know that what works in one island is not necessarily going to work in another island. So bearing in mind that each island is going to have a unique, potentially have a unique circumstance around that. So on to the next slide. These strategic outcomes from the National Islands Plan link up very neatly with the Sustainable Development Goals as developed through the UN. And also Scottish Government has a dashboard of over 80 wellbeing indicators that move past the kind of economic indicators and this kind of growth model for success. So the plan is looking at a wide variety of indicators. And then finally on this last slide here, it's really about the shift in power. So that's the research areas for me. Does the plan give the councils what they asked for? Do the councils represent the community? Has there been a change in relationship? Can the mechanisms put through the National Alliance Plan match up with increased community empowerment? How do we measure that community empowerment? So the second part of my research method is going to be more quantitative, a survey that is going to be sent out through the islands, asking people what their relationship has been to outcomes from the various things. So it could be things like ferry transport, access to broadband, access to childcare. So the questionnaire is going to encompass how people are actually finding, has there been any change for better or worse as a result of the National Islands Plan. So in a nutshell, that's my research. I'm in the literature phase of this, developing the methodology, hoping to capture some data before the end of the year. So last slide. Just a reminder of the research areas, and thank you very much for listening. And I'll pass back to Mike.
Thank you very much, Adele, and thank you to all our 5 speakers. I mentioned at the beginning, this is just a small selection of the research effort that's going on in Orkney. I'm sure that's a small snapshot of what each of those individual research students are actually undertaking. Orkney really does punch above its weight in terms of what it's doing. We have time for a few questions, so there's still time to put your questions on Slido, and there's the code. There are a lot of questions already online, so I'd like to invite all 5 speakers to come on screen at the moment, and we'll take a few questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to get through every one of them, but we'll see how we go. So I'm going to start with Alona. We have a question here. For Alona, how do you see Orkney becoming more sustainable for tourists? What methods would you enact first?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And I'll probably start answering by saying that I think Orkney has to become sustainable not for tourists, but for its communities and for people who live in Orkney. And once the communities are happy, the visitors are going to be happier as well. And I think the kind of main, from my conversations that I've had with the members of Orkney communities, there's 2 kind of motives coming across. That's carrying capacity and that's infrastructure. So you need to first define as Orkney communities, and being an archipelago makes it that much difficult because you will have different locations and different sustainability needs. Define what's your carrying capacity, what is it you want, and then match it with the infrastructure. And I think this will be the first kind of couple of steps to take for this sustainability quest.
Thanks, Alona. I'll throw one more question at you before we move on to Katie, and that's question: did your research reveal any unexpected beneficial or harmful consequences of the tourism strategy?
Well, I think I mentioned I haven't analysed the data yet, so it was just kind of my impression from the conversations that I've had so far. I'm not sure how unexpected it is, but of course there is a benefit of a strategy. It's a common direction, and everyone who reads the strategy and reflects on it will go, "Oh, that's a good objective to have. I'm happy that my destination is going towards dispersing the benefits or making sure that the cultural and environmental heritage is being taken care of." So having this mutual direction, common direction for everybody to be involved, it has this sense of ownership as well on the communities, and so that's the benefit. From the harmful perspective, some might say that having just a strategy without action plan backing it up might look like a tick box exercise. It's not, but I know, I understand why people kind of think that it is. And it also, because again, being archipelago, which is quite difficult, kind of context, it might be difficult to address the needs of each and every community, each and every island, because what Kirkwall needs will not necessarily going to be what Sandy needs or North Ronaldson needs. So having this one generic 5-page or 10-page document sometimes feels like a bit not deep enough. So this kind of challenges that strategy makers will need to address.
Sure. Thanks, Ilona. Good answer. Can I move on to Katie then? So your first question is, have you grown or maintained seagrass within a lab setting with its habitat to study it further? So what do you think that holds?
Yeah, well, I haven't personally, or it was a MSc thesis, but I know that Project Seagrass have got a nursery down. There is nurseries, and there's a as I mentioned, there's a number of restoration projects happening throughout the UK. And you can find out online, you can go and have a look yourself. There's one called Sea Wilding, it's a community-based one, and I know that Project Seagrass have got a nursery as well. So there's a lot of work, and it is shared. It's very easy to find online if you Google it, but I haven't done them.
Thanks. Here's another question for you. Did you find any critters you were not expecting?
Not massively. I think it was quite surprising. The photos that I had up, there was a lot of snake lock and anemones at one site in particular. They were just everywhere. And then at one of the other sites, they weren't there at all, which was quite surprising to see such a big difference in the abundance of the animals. The other picture of the stock jellyfish as well was quite rare. That was quite an exciting find. But yeah.
Yeah, I've never seen one of those. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, we saw two, a green one and an orange one.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to move on to Flora. So, Flora, here's an interesting one. How did you get into community energy?
That's a really nice question. I grew up in a very remote rural part of the West Highlands, so I've grown up surrounded by both renewable developments and community developments. So they were I grew up seeing the impact that they can make in rural communities and how powerful that can be to change the sort of success and stability of communities. So it's always been something that I've been very interested in. And then when I started my academic journey, I trained originally as a landscape architect and got into researching how you can work with communities to design renewable energy projects so it can ease the process getting through planning, and so that led me into that. And then through my technical study with renewable energy development, my skills were sort of developed to help them in a more technical way, and it's always been something I've been very interested in.
Thanks, that's interesting, and you make that bridge between the landscape architecture and renewable energy. Yeah, I can see that. Okay, and let's find another one. Look, this looks like a great thing. So community energy looks like a great thing for remote, rural and island communities. Is there wider scope to contribute to the energy transition at a national level?
Yeah, so I think community energy, I mean, it's very prominent in rural communities, and I think it's been incredibly important in allowing them to take ownership of the problems that they face and create solutions. But in more recent years, it's also been it's spread and it's continued to develop. So we get it in more urban areas. There's city versions of community energy projects with solar panels on city buildings and things. So it is spreading across the country already, still at sort of smaller scales, but tackling local problems. And I think the work that I'm doing in terms of evidencing the indirect benefits will have national implications, because we can use that evidence to provide the quantitative evidence that policymakers need to see what policies that can be implemented. There have previously been very good policies with funding available for income generating funding that's been removed. So the feed-in tariffs are no longer available for any developments. So encouraging policymakers to see the benefits of community energy and how they can implement policy to benefit that and to allow the sector to thrive again, I think will have national implications.
Excellent, thanks. I suspect those themes will sag through to Henny's area. So let's have a look at questions for Henny. So for Henny, who will you present these findings to? And what change do you hope to see from your findings?
So thank you for the question. So at the moment, I have collaborations with national with the NGO institute in Jakarta. So it's called Purnomo Yusgiantoro Center. So we are doing collaborations on part of my thesis. So the hope is we're going to create like a concept to do a pilot projects, and the finding will be by the network that one of them that the PYC Purnomo Yusgiantoro Center has. One of them is can be the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of the Energy. So because the concept of the community energy is already been done in Indonesia, but it's still relatively, in terms of the percentage, is quite small. So they are spreading, but we don't know unless we, like specifically knowing the community that doing it. So this is one of the things that looking at the approach, not only from large company to provide the renewable energy, but also from the approach of the bottom up of the community energy spreading and providing the electricity to the community.
Thanks, Annie. And then just follow that up with a very quick one. What's the current mix of power generation in Indonesia? How far have you got to go with this?
So I'm based on the last statistic that we have in 2021. So the main for the power and the electricity is from the coal. So Indonesia is top 5 in terms of coal producer in the world. So coal is the main percentage, maybe around 40%, and then oil and gas. And the renewable energy, it's still very low at the moment. It's still like less than 10%. As I mentioned in the presentation that we are hoping 23% by 2025, but it probably quite difficult at the moment because we have the pandemic, COVID, and hence the focus has been slightly shifted to more food security at the moment than to get this objective. So it's probably going to be a bit slow in the progress.
Thanks, Henny. So a lot of potential, a lot of way to go. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move on finally to Adele. Got a good lot of questions here for Adele. Let's see, scan these. Adele, what occupation types have you got to work with when investigating policy and the National Islands Plan?
Yeah, it spans across the different, it covers everything from education to energy to governance, so local authority. Some of the strategic outcomes are based around apprenticeships, so that flagship about developing the young workforce, but also from previous research areas as well, importance of things like childcare and social care and how they can contribute to the economy. So it come to the conclusion that you can't really single out any one area. So that's why I'm focusing on complexity, which doesn't just mean it's complicated, but that you can have properties that emerge, or you can have industries or people that can change the way a policy has outcomes in the real world. So you can't just pick out one occupation from that spectrum. So it does really cover the breadth of the workforce in Scotland.
Thanks, Adele. And then quite a fundamental question here. Why do you think the National Island Plan will work?
I don't think I said it will work, that one, but I do think it's a great opportunity, to be honest. So we heard about policy through quite a lot of the talks today, and how fundamentally it is important to directing business, local policies being made, how they link in with the national policies as well. However, what I do think we do have, so once the plan runs out of its lifetime, we have the laws that have been made to back up that kind of, you know, the importance of the island communities as well. So I think within all of those pieces of literature and those acts in that policy landscape, you know, there is a relevant and very applicable you know, feedback mechanism there that lasts out with the plan that saves to help island communities in their journey towards sustainability.
Excellent. So definitely something to watch. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. That has to be our last question, and my apologies if we didn't have time to get to your question. So firstly, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for listening and engaging. I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll engage again next year. And also to our speakers, thank you very much for 5 fascinating, insightful talks. That was just great. Before we finish, I'd just like to give a few housekeeping notes, because there's a lot going on in the Science Festival over the next few hours. So the Family Day at Kirkle Grammar School is on now, and the afternoon session continues until 4 o'clock. With lots of science-based activities to get involved in. And my colleague, Dr. Sandy Kerr, will be speaking about Who Owns the Sea in the lecture theatre at the Heriot-Watt campus. That's the Robert Rendell building at 11:30 a.m. So online, the next event is at 2 o'clock, and that's with geologist Dr. John Flett Brown. I think there's a film there where John is speaking about the fossil shore of Lake Orcady. So plenty to do. Check your program and click on the links to view the online events. And finally, don't forget to like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So once again, thanks to our 5 excellent speakers, and also to the wonderful festival tech team, without whom we would be lost. They work in the shadows and make all of these events possible. So for now, until the next time, goodbye. So we're going to switch our cameras off, and we'll see you the other side. Bye-bye.